The first strike came without warning. The sky over Earth split open like torn fabric, and from the wound poured fire. Whole cities vanished in an instant, their streets glowing with molten ruin. Oceans rose in steam and boiling clouds hung heavy. Above the world, the people of Earth stared upward at the alien fleets that blotted out the sun, enormous shapes of steel and flame that moved with terrible precision, in silence and awe. The sound came later, the roar of collapsing towers, the cries of families running from falling glass and fire, and the endless hum of engines that carried destruction from the heavens. In those moments, the world was no longer divided into countries or creeds. It was simply Earth struck down by an enemy that came without mercy. The first ships appeared over the great cities where light had always marked civilization. New York and Shanghai, and Delhi and countless more. Their defenses crumbled like sand. Before waves, towers fell and bridges cracked as if the planet itself shuddered under the assault. The oceans boiled and the air thickened with ash. Firestorms swept across neighborhoods where only hours before children had played and markets had bustled. Now the streets lay silent, filled with smoke and shadows of what once had been those who survived. The first blasts stumbled into the ruins, their faces marked by disbelief and terror. They looked skyward at the vast alien machines, and felt as though the gods themselves had turned cruel. The sky glowed red as if the planet bled, and everywhere the screams echoed against the broken bones of cities. Families clutched each other in the shadows while soldiers rushed to defend what could not be defended. Missiles fired upward streaks of light against the void, only to vanish like sparks before rain. The enemy moved too fast, too strong, too merciless. Earth's satellites fell one by one, shattering into dust that glittered faintly in the upper atmosphere. The communication lines flickered and died. The world's leaders reached each other in fragments, voices carried through static-filled channels, words half lost in the roar of fire, but the message was clear. Cities were gone, millions were dead, and the invaders had no interest in surrender or negotiation. The attack was not a war, it was extermination. The coastlines, waves of refugees fled inland as alien strikes pounded ports and harbors. Ships burned and sank, their flames reflected on the black surface of the sea. Those who once dreamed of voyages across the stars now only dreamed of surviving another night. The forests burned, the deserts shook with thunder, the mountains themselves cracked under bombardment. The whole planet seemed to groan under the weight of annihilation, and yet within the silence between explosions, something stirred in the hearts of survivors. The grief was bottomless, but behind grief came fury. No longer did people ask why, no longer did they cry for help from unseen powers. Instead, they clenched their fists and swore vengeance. Though their voices were small against the roaring skies, they carried the weight of an entire species that refused to vanish, and in the ashes of that first strike humanity realized that it would rise or die together. Nations that had once spoken only in arguments now stood together beneath the same darkened sky. Their leaders gathered through cracked communication lines and shattered satellites, their faces projected into hidden chambers carved beneath mountains and bunkers built long ago for wars that never came until now. The air in those places was heavy with smoke and silence, as generals and presidents and kings and ministers stared at one another, not as rivals but as survivors of a planet scarred beyond recognition. The first words spoken were not of treaties or strategy, they were words of grief. Each leader carried the loss of cities, wiped away in moments, entire populations erased in firestorms of alien fury. They spoke of millions gone in the blink of an eye, their names already reduced to numbers in grim reports read aloud by trembling voices. The sorrow was deep, but sorrow could not stand alone. Behind it there grew something harder, something sharper, and every eye in that chamber carried the same unspoken truth that Earth had been violated, and Earth would answer. Across the globe, television screens flickered through static, showing fragments of speeches and broken broadcasts. People huddled around radios and shattered devices, listening as their leaders declared that there would be no surrender, there would be no negotiation. The genocide had shown the true face of the invaders, and now humanity would show its own. Voice after voice promised that this was not the end, this was the beginning of something the world had not seen before. Unity born, not of peace, but of fury. The armies that once faced each other across borders now shifted their weapons toward the stars. The generals who had long whispered of rivals across oceans now spoke instead of vengeance. In the void, factories that once supplied separate nations began to trade blueprints and designs. Their scientists linked through secure cables and encrypted codes. They shared everything from medicine to engines to weapons for survival now, depended not on secrecy but on the open hand of alliance. And the streets' ordinary people felt the shift. They saw their flags lowered and raised again, as part of something larger, one banner of Earth itself. The children of shattered cities raised their voices, not in songs of mourning but in chants of defiance, and the broken turned their pain into steel. Volunteers flooded into camps eager to fight, pilots, engineers, farmers, and scholars, all offering their hands to a single cause in every corner of the planet. The message was the same, that humanity had lost much, but it had not lost its will. The faces of the leaders, once pale in grief, struck hardened into lines of iron. They spoke with voices that shook, less with sorrow and more with resolve. They told their people that history would no longer be written in treaties signed in quiet halls, but in fire that reached beyond the sky. In that moment, Earth became something it had never been before, united by death and grief. Yes, but more than that, united by fury and purpose. The leaders looked at one another, and they no longer saw rivals or strangers. They saw warriors bound to the same destiny. The genocide had stripped them of their illusions, and for the first time in all of human history, humanity truly stood as one. Peace was a word still whispered in some corners of the shattered earth, but it was a fragile whisper quickly drowned beneath the roar of grief and rage. There were those who had hoped that the invaders might be reasoned with, that treaties might be forged as they once had been between human nations, but the images of entire cities erased by fire, the recordings of children buried in rubble, and the endless silence where millions of voices once sang, crushed such hopes beneath the weight of truth. The truth was simple. The enemy had not come to talk. They had not come to share knowledge or to offer dominion. They had come to erase, to burn, to destroy. Without hesitation, they had shown no interest in surrender, no gesture of mercy, no sign of hesitation. The genocide was their language, the genocide was their law, and in the ashes, humanity learned that to speak of peace was to speak of extinction. Leaders, who had once sat at long tables speaking of cooperation and compromise, now stood in war rooms with maps spread across walls and screens, each one marked with red scars showing the places that no longer existed. They stared at those marks in silence. And then, one after another, their voices cut through the silence like blades. They declared that mercy was no longer possible, that restraint was no longer survival, that peace was dead and buried with the cities already lost in the streets of ruined capitals. Survivors gathered around broken fires, their faces painted with soot and despair, and yet when they heard the words spoken by their leaders, a strange strength began to kindle within them. Their tears dried into grim determination. Mothers, who had lost sons and daughters, swore to see justice in the stars. Soldiers, who had barely escaped burning cities, swore that their rifles would answer the genocide the way humanity always had, with resistance and vengeance. The last voices of pacifism faded like smoke one by one until they were drowned entirely by the new chorus that rose from every corner of the earth. It was not the soft hymn of peace, it was the thunder of rage. Unified and unstoppable politicians who had once spoken in measured tones now roared like soldiers. Generals who had once counseled patience now demanded action. Scientists who had once dreamed of discovery now sharpened their dreams into weapons. The word restraint lost its meaning, and civilization shed its mask, for humanity realized that the rules written in peace could not apply to monsters that slaughtered without thought. The people began to whisper to one another that to be civilized was to be weak, that to be weak was to die, and so the chains of civility were broken and cast into the ashes of fallen cities. Across the world, a transformation spread as swift as fire across dry fields. Neighbors who had once distrusted each other now stood shoulder to shoulder as brothers and sisters. Warriors in waiting. Humanity had been torn open by genocide, but in that tearing something had been revealed, something that had always lurked beneath the surface, a force primal and unyielding that no invader could comprehend, and from that force came the promise that Earth would answer, not with peace, but with war. Factories that had once produced the comforts of life now roared with the sound of war. Entire industries turned overnight into engines of vengeance. Assembly lines that once shaped cars and machines of peace now hammered out tanks and ships and weapons forged with fire and urgency. The air above cities filled with smoke and sparks as workers labored through endless days and sleepless nights, every hammer strike echoing the promise that Earth would not bow to genocide. Scientists who had once dreamed of medicine and space travel now bent their minds to the craft of destruction. Laboratories glowed with cold blue light as men and women scribbled formulas onto boards, equations that transformed into designs for missiles and cannons. Engineers dug deep into archives, pulling out ancient concepts for weapons once deemed too dangerous for civilized times, and now those designs were reborn, stripped of restraint, refined with fury and necessity. Across continents, hidden bunkers were opened, old warheads were dragged from their tombs and given new life, satellites were reconstructed to carry weapons instead of cameras, and the skies above began to hum with machines crafted for battle, drones by the thousands rising like metallic swarms, their wings cutting through smoke-filled air as they formed patterns of steel against the horizon. And in the shipyards along the coast's, hulls, larger than towers, were welded together, glowing red as their spines took shape under the hands of countless builders. Every citizen of Earth found a place in the great machine of survival. Children too young to fight gathered scrap and carried water to the workers. Mothers and fathers who had lost everything sharpened their grief into steel and fire, their faces hollowed by sleepless nights, but lit with the fierce determination of vengeance. The sound of industry became the heartbeat of Earth, a rhythm of clashing metal and roaring engines that spread across every nation, now united under a single banner. In the desert's great foundries rose their chimneys, pouring black clouds into the sky, while deep in frozen tundras, machines rumbled and cut through ice to unearth rare metals, once too costly to mine, now essential for the war to come. Forests were cut to fuel furnaces, and rivers were dammed to power the hunger of industry. The land itself gave everything it had to the cause, and humanity accepted the cost for survival, demanded nothing less. As the days turned into weeks, the weapons began to emerge, rows upon rows of armored vehicles, their hulls painted with the flag of Earth, squadrons of jets and ships, their wings gleaming with steel, fire reflecting in their surfaces, and towering mechs with eyes that glowed like stars in the night, prepared for battle that would stretch beyond their world. The very planet groaned under the weight of its transformation, yet it did not falter. The invaders believed they had shattered a fragile people, but what rose from the ashes was no longer fragile, no longer bound by restraint. The Earth itself had become a forge, and from that forge came the promise of fire and vengeance, a storm that would soon reach into the heavens. From the tundras of the north to the deserts of the south, the armies of Earth rose like waves upon waves, drawn from every land and every people, no longer divided by flags or borders, but united beneath a single emblem, the emblem of survival, the emblem of vengeance. Humanity itself became the banner carried into the storming, the great fields of once divided nations. Lines of soldiers stretched beyond the horizon, their armor gleaming with steel forged in the fires of industry, their eyes hollow with loss yet burning with fury. These were not professional armies bound only by training. They were teachers and farmers, students and builders, ordinary men and women who had taken up weapons because there was no choice, because survival demanded it. The ground shook with their march, and the air pulsed with the thunder of their voices. Cities that had once been ruins were now transformed into mustering grounds, where the streets overflowed with columns of tanks and carriers' banners draped across shattered skyscrapers, declaring, in words bold and unyielding, that Earth fights as one across the ocean's great fleets. Assembled, their decks crowded with soldiers, staring into the waves as though the water itself carried them toward destiny. And in the skies, squadrons of jets roared in formation, their trails burning white against the black smoke of a scarred planet. The people watched them go, not with sorrow but with a grim pride. Mothers pressed the hands of their children into the hands of soldiers. Fathers gave their rifles to the young, who now marched to the front lines, and the old lifted their voices in chants that echoed across continents. No one doubted that many would never return, but no one doubted either that they marched for something greater than life itself. They marched for humanity. They marched for vengeance. They marched for Earth. Every continent pulsed with the rhythm of readiness. Africa sent legions of armored carriers across its plains. Asia raised fleets from its coasts. Europe filled the skies with drones and bombers. The Americas thundered with tanks rolling out from vast factories, and Australia became a fortress bristling with cannons that pointed skyward, ready for any strike. The world was no longer divided into regions. It was a single war machine, breathing with the same heart, pounding with the same fury. The soldiers stood in endless rows, their rifles gleaming, their armor battered yet strong, and each one carried the same fire in their eyes, the fire of survivors who had seen genocide and refused to fall, the fire of those who had buried their families and yet risen to fight, the fire of humanity Unchained from restraint, their chants rose into the air, echoing across battlefields yet to come, words simple and terrible. We are Earth, we are vengeance, the invaders had believed. Earth fractured and weak, but what stood now upon the scarred soil was a force that no empire had ever faced before, not the armies of nations, but the army of a species, a tide that could not be turned back. And in that moment the galaxy itself seemed to tremble at what was coming, for humanity had risen, united, and it would not rest until the stars themselves echoed with its fury. The first counterattack did not begin with speeches or ceremony, it began with fire. The black sky above Earth trembled as engines roared louder than storms, and the fleets of humanity broke from orbit like arrows of steel, and flamed, their hulls glowing with the heat of ascent, their trails burning bright against the void. The sound of their departure echoed across continents, as if the planet itself was howling its fury into the heavens. From the shipyards along shattered coasts warships emerged, vast and unyielding, forged from the bones of ruined cities. Their armor thick, their cannons bristling with the promise of vengeance. Each one carried crews drawn from every nation, men and women who had never spoken the same language before, now shouting together in the single tongue of rage and defiance. Within their steel walls, the air vibrated with determination, every heartbeat pounding with the same rhythm, the rhythm of retaliation. Missiles streaked upward like falling stars in reverse, their trails slicing through the darkness to strike against the first enemy patrols that dared linger near. Earth explosions flared across the void, lighting alien hulls with fire as debris tumbled weightless in silence. But the silence did not last. It was broken by the thunder of human guns and the screams of engines driven to their limits. Earth had sent its answer, and it was not words, it was war. The first battles were chaos, the enemy still confident in their superiority, their ships sleek and vast, their weapons honed across centuries of conquest. But humanity fought with desperation, and desperation was sharper than any blade. Fighters darted between cruisers, swarming like hornets against towering behemoths, drones unleashed from carriers by the thousands, darting through gaps in shields and slamming into hulls with suicidal precision. The void became a storm of light and steel on the ground across Earth. Billions watched through flickering screens and cracked devices, their hearts pounding as they saw alien ships burn for the first time in the skies above their planet. Cheers rose through the ruins of cities, through the camps of refugees, through the factories that had birthed the weapons. This was not victory. Not yet, but it was proof that the enemy could bleed, proof that Earth was not helpless, proof that humanity had found its fire. Again commanders in orbit shouted orders, their voices raw with fury and hope. Squads reported losses but did not falter, every death only feeding the rage that pushed them forward. Entire wings of fighters vanished in firestorms, yet others surged to fill their place. The fleets pressed on, and in the silence between explosions the soldiers whispered the same vow over and over: we are Earth, we are vengeance. Counterattack did not end with triumph, but it did not end with despair either. For the first time since the genocide began, the invaders retreated, their patrols shattered, their arrogance shaken. They left behind wreckage drifting among the stars, and humanity looked upon that wreckage with unyielding eyes. The war had only begun, but Earth had shown its answer, and it was an answer carved in fire. Alien strongholds fell one by one as humanity carried its fury across the stars. The first worlds struck were fortified colonies that the invaders believed unbreakable, their towers of steel rising like claws into the sky, their shields shimmering like walls of light. But the armies of Earth did not come with hesitation. They came with fire and steel. They came with rage, sharpened into strategy. They came with the will of a people who had nothing left to lose and everything left to avenge. Fleets arrived in waves, filling the void with their hulking shapes, and the silence of space cracked with thunder as cannons roared. Missiles streaked like comets and drones swarmed like locusts. The alien defenses fired back, their beams tearing holes through the darkness, their weapons meant to terrify. But the humans pressed forward. Undeterred, their fighters darted between bolts of light, their frigates slammed into enemy lines, refusing to retreat. Every explosion painted the black with new stars born of fire and fury on the ground. The battles were savage soldiers in armor descended from orbit, their boots shaking the soil of alien worlds where the air reeked of ash and ozone. Tanks rolled across fields scorched by bombardment, crushing alien constructs beneath their weight. Mechs with glowing eyes tore through defensive walls, while infantry stormed bunkers with rifles and blades. their war cries echoing in languages once divided, now bound together as one terrible and aliens had built their strongholds with the arrogance of conquerors, believing themselves invincible, but arrogance is brittle. When struck by vengeance, their fortresses collapsed under relentless assault, their walls reduced to rubble, their skies choked with smoke, and their commanders silenced one by one, their voices drowned beneath the thunder of human weapons. In the end, those who survived fled into the shadows of their own worlds, chased by the fury they had unleashed for the soldiers of Earth. Each battle was not just strategy, it was memory. With every fortress that burned, they remembered the cities that had fallen. With every enemy silenced, they remembered the children who would never grow. With every victory, they felt the weight of loss press against their hearts and sharpened their resolve. They were not fighting for conquest, they were fighting for survival, for vengeance, for the promise that never again would humanity bow. Reports flowed back to Earth, and through the ruins of its cities the survivors watched as alien worlds burned and hope flickered brighter than it had since the first day of fire. The people cheered not for glory but for justice. They saw the proof that humanity could strike back, that the monsters who had slaughtered their families were not gods but prey hunted by the fury of Earth. The galaxy began to whisper of the humans. The species once dismissed as fractured and weak, now feared as relentless and merciless. Tales spread of soldiers who fought without retreat, of fleets that struck without hesitation, of a people who turned grief into a weapon sharper than any blade. And in those whispers the invaders began to tremble, for they realized that the genocide had not broken humanity. It had forged it into a storm that would not stop until every stronghold fell. The invaders, who had once looked upon Earth as fragile and divided, now stared into the eyes of soldiers who burned with fire and into fleets that roared like storms. They had believed humanity to be weak, bound by rules of civility and shackled by hesitation, but those illusions shattered like glass under the weight of vengeance. For the humans who now swept across the stars were no longer restrained, they were no longer civilized, they were fury given form in alien worlds. Entire garrisons fell before the relentless tide, fortresses reduced to rubble and streets turned into rivers of fire. The defenders fought desperately with weapons that had conquered countless species before, yet against humanity those weapons faltered. They could not stop the soldiers who charged through walls aflame. They could not deter the pilots who dove their ships into enemy lines with suicidal precision. They could not break the resolve of a species that had already suffered the worst horror imaginable. Prisoners who once expected mercy begged for surrender, but they found none. Humanity no longer spoke in the language of peace or negotiation. The memory of genocide burned too deep and too raw to allow compassion. Those who had once pleaded for civilization to temper vengeance were gone, their voices buried with the cities that no longer existed. What remained was a will of iron, a fire that demanded not survival alone, but the obliteration of those who had dared to strike first. The galaxy began to tremble as word spread of planets falling in days. Where once campaigns had taken years, fleets of humans appeared without warning, striking with ruthless precision and vanishing into the void before reinforcements could arrive, their banners marked not with symbols of nations but with the single emblem of Earth, their war cry rising in unison, not for glory, not for conquest, but for vengeance. Humanity had become the shadow in the dark, the storm on the horizon, the nightmare whispered between enemy commanders, who realized too late that their prey had become their predator on Earth itself. The people watched as reports arrived from the front, and their grief transformed fully into pride. No longer did they weep for what was lost, for every alien world that burned was a requiem for their dead. Every fortress shattered was a monument to the fallen. Their hearts beat with the rhythm of justice. Though their eyes were still wet with tears, they no longer bowed their heads. They lifted them to the stars and whispered promises of more fire, more vengeance. The invaders had thought humanity fractured and weak, but what stood before them now was united beyond measure, bound not by politics or creed but by blood and fury. They had awakened something primal, something unstoppable, and as alien commanders studied their maps and saw their borders collapse, they understood too late that they had not merely struck Earth, they had unleashed it. So the galaxy looked upon humanity and no longer saw a people of peace and culture. It saw a storm of vengeance, a force unbound by restraint, a species that would not stop until every debt was paid. In Fire *, when silence finally returned to the stars, it was not the silence of defeat, it was the silence of aftermath. The echoes of fire fading across the void, the fleets of Earth stood scarred and battered, their hulls blackened, their crews hollow-eyed from endless battles, but they still stood where once the enemy had roared. Now there was only wreckage drifting in the endless Night-broken towers of alien fortresses shattered into dust and the bones of an empire scattered across the galaxy's humanity had won, but victory was not triumph, it was a heavy burden. Carried by every survivor, each soldier remembered the faces of those left behind, the families buried in ash, the cities reduced to smoke and rubble. They carried that grief not as weakness, but as steel forged into their resolve. They looked upon the ruins of their enemies and knew that the war had ended, but the scars would never fade. Earth was safe, but Earth was changed forever. On the alien worlds once proud and defiant, now silent. With defeat, the banners of Earth were raised, not as symbols of conquest, but as memorials to the fallen. Every fortress toppled, every throne room shattered became a reminder of what had been lost and what had been avenged. The soldiers who planted those flags did not cheer, they stood in silence, heads bowed, rifles at their sides. The galaxy had witnessed vengeance, and the galaxy would remember it. Back on Earth, the survivors gathered among the ruins of their cities. Fires no longer burned in the skies, but the scars remained. Towers broken, streets cracked, oceans darkened with ash, yet the people stood tall among the ruins. Their voices carried not with despair, but with strength. They had endured the worst horror imaginable, and they had risen not as victims but as victors. Mothers held children who would grow in a world forever marked by fire. Fathers stood beside them, with eyes hardened by what they had seen but softened by the knowledge that humanity had endured. The leaders of Earth no longer spoke in the soft tones of peace. Their words now carried weight like thunder. They promised that never again would humanity bow to genocide. They promised that the galaxy would never forget what happened when restraint was stripped away. They promised that should another empire rise to threaten their species, the response would be even greater, even fiercer, for Earth had been forged in fire, and that fire would never again be extinguished. The galaxy itself shifted in fear. The name of humanity carried in whispers across the stars. Allies sought treaties, not for trade, but for survival. Enemies reconsidered conquest when they remembered the worlds that burned under the march of Earth. Humanity had become something more than a people. It had become a warning, a force that could not be broken, a storm that no empire would dare awaken. Abandoned, so the survivors of Earth stood upon alien ruins, their vengeance complete, their grief honored, their unity unshaken. They had abandoned restraint and discovered within themselves a power no enemy could comprehend. The war was over, but the memory of it would live forever in the stars, and from that day the galaxy would look at Earth and see not a fragile world but the fury of mankind unbound.